Seb's Soapbox. And here we go again. Welcome to Seb's Soapbox, the YouTube show that makes you go, this guy again. Um, so today a white guy, will be talking about whiteness. Um, and what whiteness is and, where it comes from. Um, Within 20 minutes, so this is going to be a roller coaster. And I'm also obviously not going to be able to cover everything because, as usual, Soapbox is a soapbox. It's more of an editorial opinion piece with a few citations here and there, rather than like an in-depth study. So don't burn me at the stake if I get things right, or don't cover some specific issues or specific aspects of this very, 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 very large and depressing subject matter. So, whiteness. What's whiteness? It is a strange thing, first of all. Like many of the issues on this segment that I discuss here, it is something that, although it seems as if it would have been around forever, is actually surprisingly recent. And so instead of asking how are white people, because, well, the New York Times and the Washington Post have covered that for us. Again, this is hell. We are not the media. Today, I want to ask, why are white people? Well, now you may ask, but Seb, you are white yourself, so, well, here's the thing. I am basically white passing because I wouldn't have been quite white 150 years ago, maybe not even 100 years ago, depending on who you ask, what sources you consult, because Germans weren't quite considered white, or at least not white Americans, until, well, some point. Or rather, the categories of racial nonsense were different at various points in the past. I mean, the thing is that the racial categories and the racial categorizations over the past have changed a lot, and they were always, and kind of they are still, always in flux. But let's start with whiteness. So whiteness, in the way that we understand the concept today, is actually fairly recent. And the people who we think of as white today have not conventionally been thought of as white for as long as popular consensus would make you believe. And the same is true for some categories of non-white people as well. And also, just in terms of biology, white people are much more recent than you would, like, commonly assume, because the mutation in Homo sapiens sapiens, so in human animals, us, people, that creates whiteness as such, is actually a lot younger, well, as I said, than you'd think, because research recently has shown that white people, as in us pasty friends with pale skin who get sunburned after 2 seconds outside, are basically just roughly 5,000 years old. Before that, basically every human being, except for, exceptions like people with albinism, were essentially people of color and or black, depending on how exclusively or inclusively you are using that term. So the ancient Romans would probably not pass as white today. I know the ancient Romans are younger than 5,000 years, but still the ancient Romans are generally, like, if you actually color those statues in, they are more people of color than they are traditionally white people. They're not just white marble statues. That's not what they look like. I'm sorry, right-wing jackasses. But anyway, this is where things in terms of this whole racial nonsense becomes interesting, because what are races, right? Who is us? Who is them? And that's usually what racism or what like racial classifications are a lot of times about, because the ancient Romans thought that Asian people, like people who lived in Asia, looked quote unquote like us, right? That ancient Roman people looked like ancient Asian people, which is another reminder also that globalization is a much older thing than the current moment, and that people in ancient times could indeed travel quite far. Just not as fast as we do today. But yeah, the ancient Romans encountered Asian people, like on the predecessor of the Silk Road. There were extensive trade networks, and eventually some guy from the Roman Empire or the Roman Republic would have come across some guy from ancient China or Central Asia or what have you, and be like, hey, you just look like me, but you don't talk like me. And then go back home and be like, friends, Romans, countrymen, over yonder hills and beyond the river and then some, there's also people. And you know what? They look like us. Doesn't that make your laurels spin? It's just another bit of ancient Roman humor there for you. And even Italian explorer Marco Polo thought that the Chinese were essentially like us. And funny enough, the people of Asia only became categorized as not like us, as not white, when white Europeans started colonization projects there, and the locals didn't really agree with that. Because it turns out if you want to subjugate a people, it is much easier to do that when you decide that they are fundamentally different and lesser and not like you. So, but let's get back to whiteness specifically, and specifically to whiteness in America, or the United States, the Americas. I guess in a lot of ways, this is actually a case where whiteness in America specifically works, where America works, where we don't have to be like, oh, no, U.S. is not America, and America is not the U.S. But anyway, like, we're talking about America as, like, the Western Hemisphere, so maybe I should say whiteness in the Western Hemisphere. Anyway, whiteness in America essentially started out as a counterpoint to blackness, because white people were the ones who were free. Black people were the ones who were enslaved, categorically. And this too only happened to emerge after a while. This is not something that that immediately came once in 1619. The first African enslaved people were unloaded in Virginia, and they were like, "Oh yeah, you're black. Now we're white." No. That took a while. And this development too only happened because of planter of elites, because of the upper classes, so to speak, in the American colonies being incredibly scared of the mob, of the masses. And so they started to favor using black African slave labor over white indentured servants. Like, this is, again, like, grossly simplified, but whatever. And essentially, indentured servants would, after a while, gain their freedom and could claim their own pieces of land. And because there were a lot more of these guys than there were planter aristocrats, the elites got their knickers in a twist. And especially since the freed indentured servants then started to work together with the freed and also the still indentured African slaves, because African slaves could also gain their freedom after a while, because slavery at the time hadn't yet been made into this racialized caste system that it later became. They then eventually started to change things, because divide and conquer is the name of the game if you want to be a powerful aristocrat. You don't want to have the masses there just all in solidarity to rise up against you. And so black people became permanent chattel slaves with no chance of gaining freedom. And in contrast, whites could never be slaves. And just as a footnote here, don't buy a word of those idiots that say that the Irish were slaves too. There's there's no truth to that. Let's not even go there. And with whites being perpetually free and Africans and black people being perpetually enslaved, there could no longer be much in terms of cross-racial solidarity. And also, since racialized slaves can be treated like animals, the methods of oppression against that part of the population could be much harsher punished, which made slave uprisings less likely than the uprisings of disgruntled cross-racial coalitions of freed indentured servants. Also, let's not forget the one thing that if you promise one part of the population that they will be enabled by you to enact cruelty on another part of the population, that is always a very, very powerful thing to do if you want to just be a fascist ruler, essentially, or proto-fascist in this sense. If you say, hey, if you do what I say and keep me in power, then you can go on and beat the living shit out of these people because they're lesser than all of us. That is usually a pretty good way to get power. Anyway, so the crystallization of whiteness in this case has a lot to do with the slave trade, right? So thanks a lot, British Empire, as usual. And this development also broadly coincides with the scientific revolution and the first zoological categorization of animals into phylums and so on. And because the people designing the various hierarchies of the animal kingdom were white dudes, they quickly applied the same categorizations to people, to humans, and put themselves, white men, on top, like the good little freaks that they were. So all of that coalesces, especially in the Atlantic world, so the world that is connected by trade, mostly the triangle trade that trades in slaves and sugar and rum and all, and cotton later, through the Atlantic Ocean. And before the 19th century, most of that trade revolved around African slaves. And yes, this will be on the test. After the 19th century, the British Empire outlawed slavery. America, like the United States outlaws slavery, or does not outlaw slavery, outlaws the slave import, right? Slavery is still legal, but you can no longer import new slaves. So the slave trade becomes mostly a domestic thing, except for a few, privateers and people who say we don't give a shit. We still import people from Africa because, well, it's just somebody stop us, right? Anyway, speaking of the British, they and the Anglo-American offspring that they spawned thought of themselves as the pinnacle of God's creation, quite literally. And so in the early 19th century, a thing called Anglo-Saxon supremacy emerged. And this was kind of a proto-white supremacy. It was not quite. I mean, it is kind of racialized, but also it's not the modern understanding of race. And that was nowhere stronger than in the United States, because the Anglo-Saxons, or the Anglo-Saxon Americans, according to themselves, were just the best. And sources from the time talk about them, themselves really, as the bestest of the bestest. They found, so these Anglo-Saxon supremacist scholars found that the Europeans were the best people in the world, and among Europeans, the Germanic people were the cream of the crop. But Germanic people on the continent had mixed themselves with lesser races, like the Slavs and the Latin people. And only the Anglo-Saxons in England, or on the British Islands, well, actually, in England, like, it's not like the Irish would really figure into this for these assholes. Only the Anglo-Saxons had mixed with other Germanic peoples and were therefore the purest, the most Germanic, the bestest of the bestest of the bestest, the most supreme. And of course, this is all hogwash, but then again, I don't have to tell you that most racial supremacy is. The Anglo-Saxons, of course, mixed with the Celts that were there before the Anglo-Saxons came to England, and also with the ancient Romans, who then came in and ruled them for a couple of centuries. And the French-speaking Normans that took over in 1066 with the old William the Conqueror certainly had before done the hanky-panky with a bunch of Latin, Celt, Frankish people. So that whole, like, it's just, Yeah, time to remind everybody pure races don't exist unless your last name is Habsburg. And let me tell you, in the words of Carlos Secundas, which, yeah, I'm sorry. I should make fun of the poor guy. It's kind of ableist, but seriously, uh, pure races aren't a thing, never were, and never really will be unless you start to really badly inbreed, and that's not really something anybody really wants. And also, since the British Isles, and this is kind of the next thing there, because the British Isles were situated on Europe's west end, the Anglo-Saxon supremacists said that the best of Europe always filtered westwards. Which again kind of makes me wonder where the Irish are in this, because it's not like the Irish weren't also kind of there, or the Scots. But again, that's racial supremacy is bullshit. And when the British Islands weren't west enough any longer, these people sailed across the ocean blue and founded America. And then kept going west because God had put that country there, devoid of anything or anyone who counted to spread their wild seed on. And bada bing, bada boom, you have manifest destiny, which its inventors understood uh, themselves quite consciously as an Anglo-Saxon supremacist concept. Just read what John Sullivan, um, the guy who who coined the phrase, what this guy thought about Mexicans, for example. It's not a good thing. Trigger warning, like all the trigger warnings. Jesus Christ. At some point, the concepts of Anglo-Saxon and of white started to merge. Initially, Anglo-Saxon Americans were understood as those of old stock who could trace their lineages back to the early colonies, or even to the heap junk of the Mayflower and those jolly, yeah, they weren't really jolly, right? Those glum sourpusses of the Pilgrims. Against those people, most newcomers were measured and found, well, lacking. They were not as Anglo-Saxon. Unless they were Anglo-Saxons from England, but even then, they had to still become Americanized. And that's where we come back to Germans and Irish and Italians and so forth. None of those were traditionally seen as being on the same level as Anglo-Saxons, or as they would later be called, white Americans. But over the course of the 19th century, things started to soften, and the racial categories began to sort of blend. Germans were among the first to gain whiteness because, well, just look at me, right? Just look at this. And sure, to the pain of the descendants of the sourpuss pilgrims, my people loved their beer a bit too much, which kind of made them suspicious of them, as did the Irish, who were, to an even bigger pain of the old sourpusses, all Catholics. As were the Italians, who were also swarthy and not lily white. So, But over time, all of those melted down into various facets of whiteness, but not before, and this is where I sort of go into a little tangent here, not before, so people started to develop their own really weird ideas about what all this means, especially if you look at industrial labor, like industrial capital labor. So in the early 20th century, just to give you an impression of how recent all of this is, in the early 20th century, you still have people who are, obviously ragingly fucking racist. And a lot of these ragingly fucking racist people were industrial managers. And what industrial managers in the early 20th century were all about was just figuring out how to best, pick their workers. And so they came up with all kinds of super elaborate ways of measuring what kind of race or ethnicity, that's not really, or what kind of national origin, which is kind of overlapping with race a lot, could do what work the best. And as labor historian David Rudiger points out, that was basically all based on just prejudice. Because and that makes it into the management literature though, and therefore the prejudice, the collected coalesced prejudices of the industrial managers um, basically become accepted common knowledge, and then you end up with elaborate charts. Like there's like a chart produced by the Central Tube Company out of Pittsburgh in the 1920s. And it really, at the top of the line, the people who can do any kind of industrial job and will excel at it and are the best are Americans, white. At the very bottom of it, well, you might think blacks, but no, you are wrong. This is the early 20th century. At the very bottom, obviously, for people who know they're racists, are Jews. Because the managers thought, well, Jews are the Jews are just the worst workers you can have, because they just always want to be in a position where they can haggle and just get the best out of everything and just exploit everybody else. Which, yeah, that's just a little bit of raging anti-Semitism for you. Because, well, I don't know, like these days, a lot of Jews kind of are white, right? It's kind of weird to sort of like go back and be like, oh yeah, people like anti-Semitism was very broadly accepted, and is kind of like just within the whole racist bullshit, just ball of nonsense. Black Americans are actually fairly well rated by these people. They're especially just good at just hard work, and good at stuff that requires speed, but bad at stuff that requires precision, because, well, we're black. So and it just gets worse from there on out. The funny thing is that these people that this chart rates Germans as fairly bad. So Germans are under Romanians, Dutch, black people, Scandinavians, Poles, Russians, the English. And I told you, like, this becomes really weird. The English are under Italians, and Italians were widely considered to be pretty bad by a lot of others, because they kind of like, there's like Southern Italians and Northern Italians. Northern Italians are whiter, and then it's also just like who is white. So yeah, and this is from 1925, so this is really just weird. But anyway, over time, all of, like, whiteness just absorbs more and more people into it. These days, we would not differentiate between Italians and Germans, and like, sure, there's like some sort of ethnicity and like cultural background, but it's not like they're not white. Anyway, but there's one category of people, the Chinese, who at this point, so in the like earlier in the 19th century, when all this started to somewhat soften and coalesce, were no longer like us. So much so, actually, that the Chinese were the first racial group of immigrants. I stress this because it's not like black people were not worse off long before that, but black people were not immigrants. Black people were forced to immigrate. They didn't have a choice here. So Chinese people were the first racial group of immigrants that experienced some serious systemic racism, to the point that they got their own act of Congress in the Chinese Exclusion Act to stop the quote-unquote Asiatic hordes from storming the fair beaches and the fairer white women of California. Because there's always kind of a weird sexual connotation to all of this. And then in the early 20th century, the American courts decided that no, even if Japanese aren't Chinese, they are also not white and can't become immigrants. Sorry, don't come. And then they also decided that although Indian people had culture, they also weren't white, and so, again, don't come. And then they made a big old law that slammed immigration from anywhere but select places of white Europe shut until 1965. between 1924 and 1965. And at that point, and this shows us how weird whiteness is, Mexicans were by and large considered white. Um, there was no differentiation between race and ethnicity yet. And that's kind of an important sort of factor there. And then in the census of 1930, a new category was introduced that separated Mexicans and Mexican Americans out from white people. And well, since the law had just decided that only white people can immigrate, the advocates of Mexican Americans started a very broad and very strong lobbying campaign. And by 1936, the Census Bureau changed its tone and withdrew the separate Mexican racial category, so that in the 1940 census, Mexicans were, in the eyes of the law anyway, white again. And again, a footnote here: it's in the eyes of the law, right? We all know the Zoot Suit riots, and if you don't, look them up. Mexicans were still very heavily discriminated against, and well, still are heavily discriminated against. So, and yeah, and if that doesn't give you a good idea of how just utterly arbitrary and bullshit racial categories are, then I don't know what else to tell you. Like time, race is a social construct. It really makes your head spin until you fall off your soapbox. Thanks for listening and watching. I'll be back in 2 or 3 weeks. I haven't quite decided yet. No soapbox next week because This Is Hell is on vacation mode until our glorious host Chuck returns on August 16th. So probably the next soapbox will be on August 16th. Until then, I wish you all a good evening.